Thanks for joining us on the program. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Here's what's coming up within the half hour. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky calls for face-to-face meeting with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in a renewed bid to end the war. U.S. President Donald Trump says Cuba is next after Iran, pledging very good plans. Plus, experts warn of the reality of a warming world on World Environment Day. Let's begin the world today. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for a face-to-face meeting with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in a renewed bid to end the war. In an open letter to the Russian leader, President Zelensky said it would be wrong to simply wait until the war in Europe returns to the center of U.S. attention, adding that peace can only come through direct engagement between the two countries. He's also called for a full ceasefire for the duration of the proposed negotiations, a move President Putin has previously ruled out. The Kremlin confirmed it had received the letter, adding that President Putin would be briefed on the contents. Speaking of the Russian President, Vladimir Putin has described a phrase he could say to Zelensky during a meeting to conclude a peace agreement, saying would be, "Thank God that it's all over." In addition, the head of the Russian Federation made it clear he is ready to sign an agreement with Zelensky, despite Moscow having questions about his legitimacy. President Putin emphasized that Moscow intends to make peace with Ukraine, noting that Zelensky's powers expired in May of 2024. He's also suggested Ukrainian authorities do not want the end of the war because they fear losing power. We'll stay on in Ukraine for a while. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed the Ukraine Support Act by a 226 to 195 votes. The legislation authorizes $8 billion in military financing loans for Ukraine and NATO allies while extending sanctions on Russia. House Republican leadership initially refused to bring the bill to the floor. However, lawmakers successfully utilized a discharge petition, which requires 218 signatures to force a floor vote without leadership's approval. Republican Representative Randy Fine criticized the legislation, arguing it appeared to be copied and pasted from earlier sanctions bills targeting Iran and had little connection to the war in Ukraine. Democratic Representative Lloyd Doggett defended the legislation, stating that President Donald Trump was too weak, too reckless to end the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
It's clear after rereading it, someone just copied and pasted from another bill, not having anything to do with Ukraine, not having anything to do with Russia, a bill relating to Iran. They just simply forgot to switch the countries. We deserve better than that as we debate a bill. Some of the sections are outdated, and they would harm U.S. national security. 102b5 urges all NATO allies to dedicate at least 2% of their GDP to NATO. As has been said at the June 2025 Hague Summit, they agreed to 5%. Why would we pass a bill that says we want you to do 2%? We've got NATO allies that ain't so great anymore. I would focus on Spain, for example. Why would we in this room want to pass something where we as a body are saying, no, 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 you don't have to do 2% would be A-OK. But the worst thing about the bill, it actually would hurt Ukraine. It wouldn't even help them. This bill is not about helping Ukraine. This is not about standing up to Vladimir Putin. This is about engaging in Trump derangement syndrome as President Trump tries to bring this in for a landing. This bill should be voted down, and frankly, given the drafting errors, we shouldn't even be spending the time talking about it.
I want Republicans to stand where Ronald Reagan would be if he was here right now. Ronald Reagan would be voting yes tonight. He'd be standing up for Ukraine and opposing Russia. This is our Churchill moment or our Chamberlain moment, and by God, I'm going to choose Churchill, and this House better choose Churchill tonight.
To the U.S. president now, Donald Trump says he's going to win in Iran one way or the other, either through military means or on paper. He was speaking to reporters in the White House on Thursday. In recent days, there have been reports of the sides closing in on a deal with a potential 60-day ceasefire extension, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and the end of the U.S. blockade of Iran's ports, all set to be on the table, followed by talks on Iran's nuclear program and sanctions relief. Neither side has commented or confirmed it.
As far as Iran's concerned, you're going to find out what the deal is. But the main parts of the deal is they can't have a nuclear weapon. The strait will open immediately. It's going to open immediately. And we've largely swept for mines. We have the most sophisticated mines. They're underwater minesweepers. I actually said to somebody, one of the generals, why underwater? He said, because usually it's hostile. When you're looking for mines, typically it's not in a good neighborhood, right? So underwater made a lot of sense. When it didn't take long to figure that one out. So I think we're doing very well, but we're going to see if we're going to win one way or the other. We're going to win on paper, or we're going to win military.
Well, the United States has also imposed sanctions on Cuba's President Miguel Diaz-Canel, his wife, and 3 other individuals, the latest move by President Donald Trump to increase pressure on the country's leadership. It comes as President Trump continues to tighten measures against Cuba following actions taken earlier this year aimed at increasing pressure on the island's government. But President Trump has also hinted at further action involving Cuba after declaring success in ending the conflict with Iran, claiming that the Cuban regime has sort of collapsed. His words.
It sort of collapsed, and we're going to handle that as soon as we've finished. I like to do one thing at a time, and we'll take care of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And as soon as that's done on our way back, we'll just make a little brief stop.
Mr. President.
We'll take care of it. We want to help them out. Look, we have a lot of people that voted for Trump. Whether they did or not, it didn't matter. But I had 95% of the Cubans voted for me. They're unbelievable people. They're energetic. They're entrepreneurial. Some of the richest people in Miami are Cuban. They're unbelievable. And I'm going to take good care of them. I'm going to let them go back to their land. They want to be back with family. They have a lot of family over there. They've been treated very badly by Cuba. But we're going to treat Cuba well, and we're going to let our people go back and let them invest in Cuba if they'd like. So we have some very good plans for Cuba.
The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has informed member states that the crisis in Cuba has evolved into humanitarian emergency, affecting millions of people, worsened by the impact of U.S. sanctions and fuel shortages. OCHA Director Edem Wasornu said a severe shortage of electricity and fuel remains at the center of the crisis, with serious concerns and consequences for the Cuban population. Similarly, United Nations Resident Coordinator Francisco Pichon stressed that what is happening in Cuba is no longer simply an energy crisis, but an expanding humanitarian emergency.
The center of the situation is a severely, as I said, the energy crisis, disrupting electricity, fuel, having far-reaching consequences, limited access to water, constraining food systems, and disrupting sanitation, education, health services.
What we are witnessing today in Cuba is no longer simply an energy crisis, but it's really a situation that has evolved into a growing humanitarian emergency that is affecting millions of people every single day. Now it has been over 2 months since we launched our action plan that we call our action plan in response to the energy contingency.
And the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pledged continued investment in northern Israel, combining economic development initiatives with enhanced security measures as the government seeks to strengthen communities near the country's northern border. The Prime Minister said the policy was aimed at ensuring long-term stability and prosperity for future generations. He emphasized the importance of coexistence among Israel's diverse communities. Prime Minister Netanyahu has described the government's latest measures as a significant milestone and expressed confidence that the North would experience a transformation similar to what he said had been achieved in southern Israel. He thanked local leaders, government ministers, and officials involved in the initiative, calling the announcement a day of celebration and a major day in our shared history. This week, the EU announced plans to overhaul its digital sector, aiming to reduce reliance on Chinese and US firms and to compel tech firms from countries outside the EU to provide certain guarantees about their services. For more now, we're joined by DW correspondent Arthur Sullivan. Arthur, thank you for joining us on the program today. What exactly is this package and what are the main areas of focus?
So the European Union has called this plan the European Technological Sovereignty Package, which sounds a little bit jargony, obviously, but what it basically is a set of measures which the EU hopes will strengthen it in various high-tech digital areas and above all else make it independent in certain critical sectors from non-EU countries, so specifically the US and China. We're talking about things like AI, semiconductors, cloud computing, and so on. And the EU increasingly wants these things to be made in Europe, so to speak. So the plan is focused on a few specific things. There's a new CHIPS Act proposed that's obviously aimed at boosting semiconductor production within the EU. There's a Cloud and AI Development Act proposed that's aimed at developing Europe's AI capacity with a focus on data centres and so on. Thirdly, the EU says it wants to develop a more wide-ranging open source strategy, and that's hoped at getting European firms to work together, pool their know-how to develop tech for critical domains. And then it also wants to digitalize its energy system. So in its own words, to ensure that data centers are integrated into the European energy system.
Then what is the EU trying to achieve with this plan?
Well, yes, a lot of it sounds nice on paper, but what's really behind it is to try and divest itself of the services of US and Chinese companies as much as possible. So the EU is highly dependent on the US, on China, and some others for many of its high-tech requirements in things like digital services, certainly when it looks at the US, companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon. Then infrastructure covers a lot of Chinese firms who are involved in Europe's infrastructure network for high-tech. And then there's intellectual property. And that's before we get into something like semiconductors. I mean, the EU gets between 80 and 90% of its semiconductors from outside the EU. And when it comes to the most advanced chips, which are needed for the most high-end technology, it's completely dependent on the US and specifically Taiwan for those chips. Now, apart from that being economically damaging, because that obviously points to a profound lack of innovation within the EU economy, which in itself is a risk, this is also a security risk. Because, I mean, for years, the EU has talked about the need to de-risk from China. That's fairly obvious, given that China is a close ally now of Russia. China has designs on possibly invading Taiwan. So there's an obvious political imperative there to divest from China. But there's now a similar level of urgency over the need to de-risk from the USA, given the growing hostility from the Trump administration towards the EU. So some of those US firms we talked about, like Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, they're really deeply embedded within the European digital systems, specifically indeed within the EU's own official systems. So launching the package this week, EU officials spoke openly about their fears around so-called kill switches. That's the idea that a government which would become hostile to the EU could then, in a conflict or in a future hostile scenario, switch off vital services, including in something like the defense sector or in healthcare and transport. So that would be the idea of, turning off cloud computing services or other services which are needed in these sectors. So the EU wants to limit that risk as much as possible.
So looking good on paper, what about in practicality? How effective will this be?
Well, the EU has proposed a whole suite of laws here, policy shifts, but at this stage they are just proposals. They'll have to be agreed upon and ultimately passed and implemented by 27 member states. That's always pretty complex, it's always time consuming, and indeed there are no guarantees that, what's proposed will actually become reality. And already we have seen murmurs of opposition from national governments, from MEPs in the European Parliament, many of whom oppose these plans for various reasons. But what are the ultimate goals that the EU wants to see achieved here? So it's been treading a fine line with this plan. On one hand, trying to reduce dependence on the US, but also not annoying it too much. And already there are doubts as to whether it has achieved either of those things, because critics say that the EU has not committed enough money to this plan. And that's vital. If the EU is realistically going to create companies capable of rivaling the likes of Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, it needs to spend a lot more money to do that. And it's hard to see in that context how the EU is going to fully divest itself of those services anytime soon. And then when we talk about not annoying the US, we're already seeing accusations of protectionism being leveled at the EU. And the initial response from leading US tech firms and some of those lobby groups that represent them has been pretty negative. So in summary, the EU is good at coming up with these big overarching industrial strategies and plans, but their record on implementing them, particularly in this area, digital innovation, digital independence, is very patchy at best. And they have to do a lot to convince us that this will be any different.
Arthur, thank you so much for the explainer. We're off for a short break now. On the World Today, still ahead. Welcome back to the World Today. The world is marking World Environment Day today under the global theme inspired by nature, for climate, for our future. People around the globe are taking part in the hashtag Now for Climate movement, a campaign that uses dance and movement to highlight the urgency of climate change and the growing momentum behind climate solutions. Experts say the reality of a warming world is no longer a distant threat. It's playing out on our streets and live on our television screens.
No longer a distant forecast, extreme heat is now a daily battle for urban infrastructure, human health, and global sports. With 48 teams and 104 matches about to kick off across North America, the FIFA World Cup is under a harsh environmental spotlight, and concerns over athletes and fan safety are peaking. Scientists are warning that extreme heat has become the ultimate opponent on the pitch.
We're all watching the game, but it's stopped because it's too hot. Hot for players, for fans, for everyone. It's hot and getting hotter. That's not random. That's climate change. The planet is heating up after more than a century of burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas that traps heat in the atmosphere. And now we're feeling it everywhere.
Studies show that over 85% of the tournament's massive carbon footprint will come from fan transit, and FIFA has pledged to have emissions by 2030. Meanwhile, critics ask how mega sports truly stay green when the planet is simmering. Some say the answer might lie in how individual cities adapt.
That means slashing emissions, accelerating a just transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables, the only sustainable path to lower costs and to real energy security. Cutting methane, one of the fastest, cheapest ways to limit near-term warming, protecting forests, land and seas, helping communities adapt to the devastating impacts already here, and it means fulfilling climate finance promises to developing countries to save lives, protect livelihoods, and strengthen economies.
This World Environment Day, the United Nations has activated the groundbreaking 50 cities avoiding and adapting to a 50 degrees Celsius world called 50 at 50. This
4 LP gas tanks have exploded in the state of Puebla. The state civil protection chief said it caused a huge fireball to shoot into the sky and prompting the evacuation of approximately 2,000 people. This happened in Mexico. Attacks exploded on a property in Topeka, a small city located about 35 kilometers east of Puebla City. No deaths have been reported so far, but 3 people have been injured and are in hospital receiving treatment. The head of the Puebla Civil Protection Authority, Bernabe Lopez Santos, said in a video message 4 tanks of gas had exploded inside a warehouse on a property in Topeka. He did not identify the cause of the explosion, but he had initially reported that 4 gas tankers rather than tanks had exploded, and that the gas tankers were found in another warehouse on the same property. Photos appear to show that at least 1 heavy vehicle had caught fire, if not actually exploded. Well, Vietnam artist Vo Ngoc Hong is affectionately known as the King of Leaves, as he transforms ordinary forest leaves into durable art pieces that are both usable and wearable, such as fans, umbrellas, handbags, and the iconic conical hats. At his workshop nestled in the historic Kim Long ward of Hue, which serves as both a quaint home studio and a living natural museum, visitors are invited to experience the traditional craft firsthand or engage in interactive leaf art classes in this intimate family-operated space. Employing a meticulous technique, Vo processes almond tree leaves, stripping away pulp to create delicate lace-like skeletons that are layered, sewn, and adorned with iconic scenes. Under Hong's skilled hands, delicate leaves are reborn to carry the distinctive imagery of the Perfume River and Ngu mountain region. And that's the world today. Thanks for watching. I am Amarachi Ubani. For our viewers on the DSTV platform, up next to Places Sports News is Spotlight on the Nigerian Army. That's at 6 p.m. for our viewers on DSTV. Sports News continues on our other platforms. Stay with us.